What is going on, my home studio engineers? Thank you so much for checking out the Home Recording Network. If you are recording and mixing in Logic and dealing with problems like system overloads, latency, or just overall slowness, then this video should help you out. Now, this video might not be so helpful if you've been using Logic for a while. This video is going to be for people who are just starting out, or maybe people who have been using the Logic product for a little bit and they have just overlooked some things along the way. Hey, it's a powerful product and there's a lot to learn, so it's completely understandable. So let's hop into Logic and show you 3 things that you can do if you are running into these issues. But first, if this video helps you out at all, be sure to give me a like and subscribe so that you can be notified anytime I release a piece of content. All right, so in Logic here, what we're looking for as far as performance is right up here, our CPU and our hard disk I/O. It may look different for you depending on what version of Logic you're running. I don't always upgrade as soon as the releases come out, if everything's working. But if you don't see this, you can go to Customize Control Bar Display, and then we can see Performance Meter here, and make sure that's selected so you can see, what the load is, I guess you would say, on your hard drive and your CPU and memory. So the CPU shows the amount of CPU and RAM processing power used by Logic. And then the disk I/O shows the amount of disk bandwidth being used by Logic. And these are what you probably see spiking if you get system overloads and things like that. Now, I am in what I would call a medium-sized project for me. It looks like we have 58 tracks or buses or sends total in this project. When I've had over 100 easily in a lot of projects. So I would call this a medium-sized project, but you can see with the amount of plugins I put on a lot of my tracks that, this project could potentially run pretty slow. A lot of people working on laptops and all that might not have enough processing power, especially if you have larger projects with over 100 tracks and you have tons of vocal tracks and your vocal chains are huge. You might run out of bandwidth on your CPU and your hard drive. But if we hit play here, we can see that I'm actually doing pretty well. Now, after those initial spikes when I started the song, everything just went right down. So I'm really not using a ton of resources in this project. And that's because I have a really souped up Mac. So if we take a look at my settings here, and this isn't going to be the same for you, that's probably why you're watching this video. So I have a 10-core i9 processor. I have 128 gigs of RAM. I have a solid state drive in this. So my computer doesn't ever struggle, but yours probably does if you're working on a laptop and you don't have the amount of resources I have here. So I'm going to give you 3 things to check or do if you are experiencing slowness and latency and system overloads and things like that. But before I even get into the first tip, let me give you a freebie. If you are running Logic and experiencing any of these issues, I would first make sure that you're only running Logic. So if you come up to the little Apple icon here and go to Force Quit, it's going to show you all the applications you have open. If they don't need to be open, close them so that you only have Logic open. So that's the only application eating up your resources. That's the first thing you should try. But again, that's not the first tip. So let's get into this. The first spot you should look here is going to be if you go to Logic here and you go to Preferences, come into Audio here. This is going to be the first thing you should check. So if you've been around for a while, you may already know this, but your buffer size is the first thing you can check. And there's different settings here, and I will explain the difference between a low or a high buffer size. All right, so what the buffer does is temporarily store audio before sending it to other destinations on your computer. So an increased buffer size will actually lower the load on your CPU. But if you have a high buffer size, this is going to increase latency while you record. So this is really a give and take. So if we're not recording and we're only mixing and you're running into CPU spikes, you want to set your buffer all the way to the highest one, so 1024. That would be a good spot for mixing. But if you try to record on a high buffer like 1024, you're going to notice a ton of latency. You're going to be strumming your guitar and it's going to be like a second later that it actually reaches your ears. So that's just not going to work because, like I said, this is storing the audio somewhere before it actually gets to the final destination on your Mac. Now, if you're recording, what would a good buffer size be? So I would suggest 128. This is what most people use, but if you're still experiencing latency, you can try going down to 64 or 32. I'm also going to show you another trick after this to reduce latency, but I would try recording at 128. That's a good place to start. Now for me, I can just keep my buffer here all the time because like I said, I have a lot of resources in this computer and I really never need to change it. Now the second tip is another latency tip. So say you have your buffer size at 128, 64, and you're still experiencing latency while recording. Now, the first thing you should do is make sure you don't have any plugins on your track that you're recording. Even if they're bypassed, it still might be causing some latency. So you can try just removing the plugins from the channel strip just while you're recording. Now, what I do is just keep all my plugins in the chain bypass, but I also turn on low latency mode. And this is great. So what this will actually do is bypass any plugins that are causing latency. So if I hit record and arm this track with low latency mode on, we see that it bypassed a bunch of plugins and effect sends. Now you might ask, why do I use low latency mode if my plugins are bypassed? I don't know, it just works. So if I have a whole channel strip here with everything bypassed, I will still get latency, noticeable latency, when I don't have low latency mode turned on. So I always just have it on while I'm recording, and I've never had an issue with latency since I've started doing this. Now, if you don't have the little low latency button up here, you can just right click and go to Customize Control Bar Display. And there it is, low latency mode. And you can just check that box and you should get this little icon up at the top. Now, what do you do if you are mixing and you are at the highest buffer size? All other applications are closed besides Logic, and you're still running in to slowness or system overloads. What do you do in that case? So Apple is very smart and they've thought of this. They realize that people might not have the best machines and they still want to use a ton of plugins and things like that. So in that case, we can use a little trick here. If we right click on our track and go to Configure Track Header, we can bring up this little freeze icon. So let's put that in the track. And that's going to add that to all of our tracks. Now we have this little freeze button. So if we hit this, Logic will actually bounce the track to an audio file. Now, this hasn't actually been done yet. We've hit the freeze button, but there's one more step. So all you got to do is hit spacebar, and it is going to write that file and freeze the track. It's going to go all the way through our song and then watch what it does. So now our plugin chain is essentially bypassed. We are not going to be using any processing power on these plugins now, and they have all essentially been written into this audio file. Now, while the track is frozen, you can't actually go into any of these plugins. You can't do anything with them because they're bypassed, right? So that is one downfall, but Apple's thought of that as well. So you can do this to all the tracks in your mix. Say you want to go back and tweak something on this track, you just hit the freeze button again, and then all your plugins come back. So this is a great option if you like to use a lot of plugins and you're trying to save some CPU and resources. This is going to be your best bet most likely. If you've already set your buffer size super high and it's still not cutting it while you're mixing, this is another great option. Years ago when I started mixing, this is something that I had to do all the time because, we can't always afford a brand new computer or anything like that. This is an option. It takes a bit longer to do this. Your workflow is not going to be as speedy, but it's an option and it's there for you if you need it. That's all I really wanted to show you guys. Let me know if you have any questions, and happy mixing, guys. Hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to download your free Ultimate Home Studio Mix Guide with your go-to EQ and compression settings for all your tracks. And also be sure to register for my free online mix training that I hold a couple times a week so that you can learn how to make radio quality music from your home without breaking the bank.